building Kushner's future. But we don't have to let the Kushners of the world determine our future. We can determine our own future, but it starts with figuring out what the hell went wrong. What is it about New York's policies that have allowed landlords like Kushner Companies to not only exist and endure, but to thrive and flourish? What is it about our campaign finance system that has allowed over 10% of all political contributions at a state level to come from the very sector in which Kushner Companies belongs? What is it about our enforcement system that has emboldened landlords like Kushner Companies to the point where they literally see no risk in falsifying over 80 permit applications across 34 buildings over a 4-year period, despite it being unequivocal, despite it being criminal, despite it being a matter of public record? New York City real estate is like a football game without a referee. It is chaos. But landlords like Kushner Companies are not the root cause of the problem. They are a debilitating symptom that radiates through our affordable housing stock radiates through our affordable housing stock and into the lives of everyday people. And therein lies the tragedy, the impact this has on everyday people. I wouldn't wish what Kushner Companies put its tenants through on my worst enemy, not even Kushner Companies itself. Affordable housing dies in darkness. It is time for the mayor, the governor, and their respective enforcement agencies to turn on the lights. We are better than this, we can do better than this, and we will do better than this. And it starts with creating a more vigilant and spirited government. The new Speaker of the City Council, Corey Johnson, has established an investigative committee called the Oversight and Investigations Committee. As a nonprofit that has incessantly and obsessively been calling on our city and state government to use a more proactive model, we think the committee is an embodiment of those ideals, and therefore we look forward to a fruitful collaboration with the chair of the committee, Councilmember Torres. So, without further ado, I would now like to call up Councilmember Torres to say a few words.
Good morning, everyone. I'm City Councilmember Richie Torres, and I chair the Committee of Investigations in the New York City Council. No one is above the law. No person, no company, not even a company that bears the name of one of the most powerful people in the world. Under the leadership of Housing Rights Initiative, led by the incomparable Aaron Carr, my office has uncovered that Kushner Companies has a pattern of lying to the city of New York and falsifying building permits. Our shared investigation, our preliminary investigation, has found more than 80 falsified building permits across 34 properties in the span of 4 years. The falsification of building permits is not merely about bureaucratic paperwork. It poses a profound threat to the affordability of rent-regulated units, which is the largest source of affordable housing in New York City, and it poses a profound threat to the safety of residents who live in these units during construction. Construction safety is most critical when the units are occupied and rent-regulated. And when you lie about whether you have occupied or rent-regulated units in your properties, as Kushner Companies has done repeatedly, you're not only failing to tell the truth, you are playing Russian roulette with the lives of New Yorkers. Now, Kushner Companies is engaged in a practice that I call the weaponization of construction. The use of illegal construction to harass tenants out of their homes and to deregulate affordable housing units out of existence. We know from the record that there is a clear connection between falsified building permits and the loss of affordable housing. By way of illustration, consider the following example. In January of 2015, Kushner Companies acquired 3 rental properties and falsified 6 building permits in relation to those properties. During the period of falsification, the number of rent-regulated units in those properties fell dramatically. At 21-80 38th Street, we saw a 31% loss of affordable housing. At 23-05 30th Avenue, we saw a 74% loss of affordable housing. At 23-15 30th Avenue, we saw a 64% loss of affordable housing. There is a straight line that runs from falsified building permits to the harassment of tenants to the loss of affordable housing units. But the scandal is not only the deception of Kushner Companies. The scandal is the dysfunction of the city bureaucracy. These falsifications, the lies of Kushner Companies, were hidden in public view. We came to discover these falsifications simply by cross-referencing publicly available records, the property tax statements from the Department of Finance and the work permits from the Department of Buildings. And we found that Kushner Companies would tell DHCR and the Department of Finance that it had rent-regulated units in its buildings. And then it would tell the Department of Buildings that it had no rent-regulated units in those very same buildings in which it was planning construction. Even more troubling, there was no information sharing between the Department of Buildings and the Department of Finance. The lack of common sense coordination and communication between those two agencies meant that the right hand of city government did not know what the left hand was doing. And so in light of these preliminary findings, we are announcing a joint investigation that will look into the prevalence of falsified building permits, including but not limited to Kushner Companies. We will investigate the breakdown of communication and coordination between the Department of Buildings and the Department of Finance. And we will conduct the investigation with an eye toward developing legislative recommendations that will correct the bureaucratic failures and break down the bureaucratic silos that made it possible for Kushner Companies to lie to the city of New York and to do so with impunity. And of course, if we uncover evidence of criminal behavior, we will make a referral to law enforcement for potential criminal prosecution. And so our message here today is that even if there's no regard for the truth in Washington, D.C., there is a commitment here in New York City to defending the truth, defending the rule of law, and defending the safety of every single New Yorker. With that said, we'll take whatever questions you might have.
You mentioned, whether you can uncover evidence of criminal behavior, then you would pass it on to law enforcement. With respect to what you found with the Kushner filings, is there evidence of criminal behavior in your view already with respect to what you've uncovered so far?
Right. So we want to be careful not to prejudge the outcome of the investigation. And obviously, we're engaged in conversations, confidential. Yes, we're engaged in confidential conversations with prosecutors, but obviously, the investigation will culminate in an investigative report. And if we find evidence of what we believe is criminal behavior, we will refer it to either the district attorney or the attorney general. But I want to be clear. I'm a city council member, right? Elected officials in the city council investigate for the purpose of oversight. So I'm going to leave judgments about criminality to the law enforcement professionals in the DA's office or the Attorney General's office. But it's certainly the case that if you falsify a legal instrument, particularly a building permit, then you are committing a misdemeanor. And the specific form that we're referencing is known as a PW1. A PW1 has 26 sections. And in the 26th section, it asks you a few yes or no questions. So it will ask you, does your building have rent-regulated units? And does your building have occupied units that will remain occupied during construction? The answer is either yes or no. And we found when it came to the rent-regulated question, Kushner Companies had a consistent pattern of lying to the city of New York.
Councilman, the Kushner Companies says that a third party deals with these applications and that any mistakes or oversights are seen by a third party and corrected. Did Mr. Kushner sign any of these personally? And can you respond to that statement that these mistakes were corrected?
Yeah, it seems like it's an
Or it was an
attempt.
oversight.
It's an attempt to divert responsibility where it belongs. The buck stops with Kushner Companies. Kushner Companies hires these contractors. And the reduction in affordable housing units, as we said, is part of a scheme, a sinister scheme, known as construction as harassment. So there's a conscious effort by Kushner Companies to weaponize construction for the purpose of displacing New Yorkers from affordable housing units. And once we lose rent-regulated units, we lose them forever. So as far as we're concerned, the buck stops with Kushner Companies.
Did he sign
so-
any of these himself?
No, but we only included. Yeah. We only included permits in the analysis that had a Kushner employee who signed off on these permit applications. So as you can see in this example, this is a Kushner employee with their name, on this form, and in many cases they actually had their signature on the form. So this is not an excuse. It's part of a willful and systematic scheme. And the fact, if someone wants to claim that it was just an accident, fine. But when does an accident turn into a systematic business model? I would argue when you falsify permit applications over 80 times across 34 buildings over a 4-year period. This is not a clerical error. It is a window into Kushner Companies' business model.
The fact that falsified building permits lead to tenant harassment and the loss of affordable housing units is hardly an accident. That is the intended consequence of falsifying the building permits.
Is this a common practice among real estate companies?
So I think the purpose, one of the purposes of the investigation is to investigate just how widespread this practice is.
And it's a reason to believe that Kushner then, as part of the systematic effort, he was using the term systematic a month ago, to deregulate these apartments and to pressure tenants. There was talk of harassment, but is there evidence that this was actually a deliberate and strategic effort to remove these units from regulation?
I mean, it's clear from us that falsified permits as a means of illegal construction is an attempt to profiteer from the loss of affordable housing units. So the answer to your question is yes. I don't know if you have an answer.
Yeah, and Housing Rights Initiative in 2016, we initiated 2 class actions against Kushner Companies for illegally removing apartments from rent stabilization. This is a bit of a separate issue, but it's kind of intertwined at the same time. And that's why what we said then is that we believe that this is part of a systematic business model. And when a landlord is breaking the law in one way, oftentimes they're breaking the law in many different ways. And if you look at the Queens cluster, the buildings in Queens that they sold after they purchased it 2 years later, and they made 2 times the amount in which they bought it for, there's a money motive here. There's a lot of money to be made when you remove apartments from rent stabilization and then spike the rents to the stratosphere.
As a quick what could the city do if the investigation does yield evidence that this was a strategic effort to remove units from regulation?
Well, obviously that we can enact legislation that will fill in gaps in the system. We can force reforms internally in the Department of Buildings and the Department of Finance. And as I noted earlier, if we find evidence of criminal behavior, then we would refer it to prosecutors who would take it from there. And I just want to make one point very clear, is that New York City is facing an affordability crisis on a scale that we have not seen before. Right? We have 60,000 individuals in our shelter. It's a humanitarian crisis, and it's an outrage that we have developers and billionaires like Kushner Companies that's profiting from the destruction of affordable housing at the very moment when we need it the most.
Can you explain, I'm sorry for this,
Yeah.
why is it different? Why is it certain houses are doing this? Is there some other lack of oversight?
Look, when the city, again, The problem here is bureaucratic silos. City government is siloed, and those bureaucratic silos have become a breeding ground for rampant deception on the part of developers like Kushner Companies. And so when the city fails the people of New York, the burden falls on the city council to hold the city accountable for those management failures, including developers who violate the law.
So you're saying that the city Department of Buildings is not taking up
The scandal here is that all the information is publicly available. The property tax statements are publicly available. The work permits are publicly available. There is no excuse for failing to hold developers like Kushner Company accountable for lying to the city of New York. The Department of Buildings, and ultimately the mayor.
If a developer like Kushner Companies is found guilty of this criminality, what punishment should they face?
Again, I'm going to leave really judgments about criminal punishment to the criminal law enforcement professionals. We investigate for the purpose of overseeing the operations of New York City government. I'm not a law enforcement official, so I'll leave those judgments to the professionals. Do you want to?
And we'll defer to what it says on the permit application. And this is not my words. This is the words of the city. Falsification of any statement is a misdemeanor and is punishable by a fine or imprisonment. So that's the exact language. So we refer to that.
What initially prompted the investigation?
I will.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that initially we have a long list of, predatory landlords. Our organization has organized over 30 class action lawsuits over a 2-year period. We have organized 2 class action lawsuits against Kushner Companies. And in those lawsuits, the facts were so different than a lot of the other lawsuits we've seen. There just seems to be something that's systematically wrong with this portfolio that we decided to dig deeper. And as we dug deeper, we uncovered new things like potential building permit fraud.
And I guess one more point on what incentive does a developer have to lie on these forms? Well, if you pretend that you have no rent-regulated units or no occupied units, then you're subject to less scrutiny and less oversight from the Department of Buildings. Obviously, construction, when the units are occupied, poses much greater dangers to human life and therefore is subject to much more rigorous oversight from the Department of Buildings.
So how do you feel that in your words, the Department of Buildings and the mayor dropped the ball here?
It's an embarrassment to the city of New York that we allow ourselves to be misled even when all the information we need is staring us in the face. It's deception and dysfunction hidden in plain sight.
You talked about legislation, but what about more funding for DOB? It's chronically known for not having enough inspectors or having all these incidents on construction sites. I mean, to say, well, what would legislation in your mind possibly look like to sort of foreclose on the possibility of this happening again, but also isn't funding an issue?
Funding is a challenge, but we have to be careful. At what point does funding cease to be an explanation and becomes an excuse? Like, Aaron is one advocate, I'm one elected official, and we managed to do more to shine a spotlight on this problem than the Department of Buildings, which has thousands of employees.
We didn't have to pay anything to do it, except for Wi-Fi and, our computers.
Again, it's a failure of common sense coordination and communication between the Department of Buildings and the Department of Finance. There's a sense in which the city of New York has been an enabler of deception by failing to coordinate and communicate in a manner that common sense would dictate.
I was just going to ask, it's a matter of them not picking up the information accurately. It's a more systemic problem. There's those sort of tick fixes that we can know automatically which buildings, when an application comes in, have rent-regulated rents.
That's exactly right. And I have a colleague in the city council, Helen Rosenthal, who passed legislation establishing an office of tenant advocate. And the Department of Buildings refuses to fund the office of tenant advocate within the buildings department. So the buildings department is part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Any other further questions? Or thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.